Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We try to check out things that are off the beaten path that you probably never heard about, but if you did, they'd make a big impact on your life. Earth-shattering discoveries, grand unified theories, all-encompassing theories, magnum opuses and tour de forces, usually from pretty obscure sources. And this is our 203rd Bible Decode, and the Bible is not obscure, but the Roman origins hypothesis for the Bible is starting to become more well known with the work of Joseph Atwill's book Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, and many other much smaller works. I mean, smaller in terms of popularity, including Michael Menescat's Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult that just came out last year, Henry Davis, James Valiant, and Abelard Reichlen, and Roman Piso, Cliff Carrington. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few, but they all have been positing, and even Francisco Carrata have been positing various permutations of the Roman origins hypothesis. That is, that the New Testament was written by the Romans, not by the apostles or their their translators, not by anybody in Judea, but by the Roman Caesars, rulers of the Roman Empire, especially the Flavian dynasty from 69 until 96 AD. And that included Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Titus and Domitian. According to the theory, they wrote the Gospels, and then they backdated the story by 40 years, putting it back into the late 20s, early 30s AD. And then they also wrote a history of the war that the Romans had just gotten done fighting. Vespasian and Titus had just gotten done fighting because they were generals before they became emperors. And that war was against the Jews. This 7-volume book is called Jewish War, or War of the Jews, and it was written by a character named Flavius Josephus, a member of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars by adoption. He was adopted by Vespasian after he correctly predicted that Vespasian would one day become emperor, which was just after he defected from the Jews as a military commander and surrendered to Vespasian, saying that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. Vespasian hooked him up. He lived at Caesar's palace the rest of his life, and he became one of the court historians. Titus was a huge endorser of his book, War of the Jews. And even the Christians nowadays endorse Josephus because he is the only first century author other than New Testament writers to even mention the existence of Jesus in a offhand comment that goes for a paragraph, sandwiched in between two other paragraphs that appear to be unrelated, in a book that was written 60 years after the alleged death of so-called Jesus. That is the best evidence that exists for the existence of Jesus, and that is evidence that is nullified by the Roman origins hypothesis once you recognize that the Romans wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation, psychological warfare against the Jews. And if you read the Gospels, you have to read Josephus too, and you kind of have to understand what you're looking for. But you will recognize that whoever Josephus was, Josephus is also the author of the New Testament, or at least the Gospels. I believe the other members of his family did the rest of the New Testament, which includes a lot of Roman royals, such as Pliny the Younger, also Queen Berenike, and Tiberius Alexander, who was another Jew, and the Herod clan, that are real inspiring folks that do a lot of inbreeding to the point where it becomes complicated, like your uncle is your brother, or stuff like that, because you're so inbred. You're marrying people, and so you're related to them like 3 different ways. But the Herods, I believe, have some Hasmonean blood, which is Jewish royalty from the 2nd and 1st century BC. And they hung around with the Romans. They were the client rulers of the kings of the Jews, the true king of the Jews. And Herod the Great and many of his family. Anyway, the motive was to mellow out the Jews, because the Jews had been a huge thorn in the side of the Romans for over 100 years with their strident militancy and their willingness to die to uphold their rituals, and their willingness to die as opposed to bowing down to Caesar. That all stuck in the craw of the Romans, and they were finally like, okay, the Jews are waiting for a Messiah, a Jewish Messiah, to come and organize them to revolt against the Romans. And that's exactly what happened in 66 AD. A few self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs rose up, and they kicked the Herod king, Agrippa II, out of Jerusalem, inviting Emperor Nero to send in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. And it took 7 years for them to put down the Jews completely. By that time, Vespasian had become the new emperor, and his son Titus was in control. He utterly destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, but it took him another few years to end the war. But both Vespasian and Titus were injured or wounded in this war, and they had a huge motive to want to mellow out the Jews. So they decided to, instead of a military Jewish Messiah, to write about a Messiah, Jewish Messiah, who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and walking an extra mile with the Roman soldier's pack, believing that the Roman slave-owning soldier was the possessor of the greatest faith in all of Israel, turning the other cheek to oppression, and exhorting to his God to forgive the Romans, and at the same time never wanting to forgive the Jews, and disrupting the Jewish rituals by overturning the tables of the money changers outside the temple, and messing around with the Jewish merchants who were selling small animals for the sacrifice inside the temple. and, omitting 5 of the 10 commandments when asked directly about them. So the Jesus that appears in the gospel is 100% deferential to the Romans and very, very negative toward the Jews, exactly as if he would be if he was written by the Romans. And Paul is even worse. Paul is even more pro-Roman, to the point that we're looking at this book here today that we're going to be reading from, called Operation Messiah, which actually posits that Paul was a Roman intelligence agent. Now, these authors, Rosemary Sheldon and Thys Voskuilen, they are unaware of the Roman origins hypothesis. So they stumble upon the evidence. I mean, they understand the evidence, but they don't make that leap to the Romans wrote the whole thing. That not just that Paul was the intelligence agent. Paul was basically the character of the intelligence agent, but never existed. And Jesus was also the character of the Roman apologist, but he didn't exist either. And to be quite honest, most likely Josephus never existed either, but was a pen name of some other Roman that is writing at the court of Caesar. Now, the evidence, other than the circumstantial stuff, when they had the motive and the MO, the Romans had created a number of other religions for psychological purposes at this very time, the Flavians, and they were really the only people who even had the opportunity, because they were the only group who had a monopoly on censorship, on distribution, and on publishing. And they were the only group in question who would have been writing in Greek. But then the evidence comes in with all of the parallels between Josephus and the Gospels that show that they were written by the same hand or hands. Those encompass many different themes. One of the main themes is the military campaign of Titus is a mirror of the ministry of Jesus. They both go to the same places in the same order and experience parallel events that are spaced exactly 40 years apart. Talking about over 40 separate incidents. And also the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament, many of them are fulfilled they are all fulfilled in the pages of the War of the Jews. And many of them are fulfilled by Titus, including the most important one where he, which we're going to be talking about right away, where he talks about the destruction of the temple, that it will be torn limb from limb, or whatever he says. And exactly what he says is fulfilled by Titus. And he says, Jesus says that this is the marker of, this event is the marker of my second coming, which makes Titus the second coming of Jesus, which makes the Roman psychological operation was intended to graft the Caesars onto the Jewish tradition. So Titus Caesar is the culmination of generation after generation after generation of, by blood, forget about the Immaculate Conception for a second, which both Luke and, I think it's in Luke and Matthew, they both do that. They both give the genealogy and tell you that there's a virgin birth. So I don't see how it can be both. But yeah, so Joseph Atwill discovered that sequence, and the prophecy has been discovered and known about for a very long time, even going back to ancient times, that Titus was the fulfillment of the prophecies of Jesus and therefore is the second coming of Jesus. Nowadays, we think the second coming is about to happen now, but it happened 1,950 years ago. And then there's also a lot of parallels in the book of Luke that were discovered by Michael Menescotts. He discovered over 250 parallels. Some of them are incredibly detailed and intricate just in the book of Luke, meaning that they are completely saturating the book of Luke. He graphed them on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, and over 250 points form 5 near-perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman Caesars. And those are APTVS. Titus Vespasian, think Aegeon Pneuma, it would possibly be, that's the Holy Spirit for the AP, or Aries Piso, or both. Not sure exactly who did it, but the Romans literally signed their name to the book of Luke. They put their initials on it. So wake up. And so now we're going over this Operation Messiah, and he's talking right here about Jesus' prediction of the temple destruction. Whether Jesus predicted the temple would be destroyed in the future, or whether he made the threat himself, is moot. His enemies reported to the authorities that he threatened it. It was enough that Jesus said and did things that disturbed the Jewish authorities for his actions to be brought to the attention of the Sanhedrin. Why he was not arrested right then and there is an unanswered question. Most likely, I think this is right after he overturns the tables outside the temple. Why he was not arrested right there and then there's an unanswered question. Most likely, he just escaped and hid. Luke's account makes it clear that the Jewish authorities put Jesus under surveillance. It also says they sent secret agents to seize upon some word of his as a pretext for handing him over to the Romans. Was it, however, necessary to trump up charges against Jesus? The disturbance he had caused was both public enough and threatening enough for the Jewish authorities to move against him. Having him followed might have been a way of discovering his location until the authorities decided what to do with him. Certainly, he would have been a threat to the Jewish authorities, but he would have also been somewhat, I mean, had this actually occurred, because it's all fiction, but had this actually occurred, it would have been also a threat to the Romans just in terms of the chaos that it created. Even though he doesn't do anything against the Romans, everything is against the Jews. It still would probably, it wouldn't rise to the level of the Romans arresting him, but to the level of the Romans wanting to have some surveillance on him. Okay, this section is called the Last Supper. As a hunted man, Jesus was at great risk throughout his stay in Jerusalem. In Luke 22:15, he seems particularly concerned with sharing his Passover meal with his disciples. He had to prepare them for what was going to happen to him as a result of having demonstrated against the Roman imperial power and the injustices of the Jewish high priestly authority. The story itself suggests that Jesus made arrangements to hold the meal in secret, possibly to avoid arrest before he completed what he intended to do. He says that he was, they say, as a result of having demonstrated against the Roman imperial power. I didn't see that. In that episode, I didn't see any demonstration against Roman imperial power. A demonstration against the Pax Romana or something like that, everything is running smoothly here. The story itself suggests that Jesus made arrangements to hold the meal in secret. Details in Mark's account, 14:12 through 17, suggest that Jesus arranged for a safe house. The disciples knew nothing of the arrangements on the very day of the meal. 2 of them were instructed to find a man carrying a pitcher of water. Sounds like Aquarius. A task usually performed by a woman. And that they were to follow him to an undisclosed location. They were even given a password phrase that they would use to identify him. The man showed them a large room upstairs that had been readied in advance. The meal itself was a male-only affair, perhaps to protect his female followers from possible violence. The meal ended with Judas betraying Jesus. There have been any number of sentimental and fanciful explanations for why he did this. Matthew's Gospel in 16:15 explains that he was bribed by the high priest for 30 pieces of silver, which incidentally is exactly the amount of money that it costs for a Passover lamb. And thus he had sold out to those who collaborated with imperial rule. Perhaps he was a Roman agent from the beginning, talking about Judas here, an undercover operative who kept an eye on Jesus for the authorities. His presence in the story, in this role, would suggest that clandestine tactics were used by the authorities against the Jesus movement. This makes it all the more possible that Saul was used in the same capacity. If Judas was indeed a Roman agent, he was about to perform his last official acts, reveal the disciples' nocturnal meeting place, and reveal Jesus' identity to the arresting officers who may not have recognized him by sight. See, if they just understood that Judas is a Roman agent because he's a fictional character that was written by the Romans, every single person in this story is a Roman agent. They are all created to, put out a certain propagandist story that they concocted. That could possibly be based on, events that have happened in the past. The arrest at Gethsemane. Why did the authorities arrest Jesus? On the grounds of pure probability, the answer to this question would be the one reported by the Gospels. Jesus' public acts seem to have provoked violence. He staged flamboyant public spectacles that implicitly asserted his claim as Israel's foretold Messiah. Some authors have suggested that these spectacles were acts of calculated provocation that reflected an undisguised militancy and an obvious willingness to use force. Again, I don't know what those authors are reading exactly. Overturning a couple tables, yeah, I guess if that qualifies. But it's whose tables is he overturning, the Romans or the Jews? The same writers suggest that Jesus had a sizable following greater than his original 12 disciples. What we can be reasonably sure of is that both the crowds he attracted and his messianic pronouncements worried the priests who controlled the temple and the city of Jerusalem. The temple was a center of national as well as religious sentiment, and Jesus was a threat to their peace. All four Gospels report that Jesus was arrested at night, but none of the Gospel writers tell us why. Each Gospel treats the scene differently, although they all leave the general impression of a scuffle in the Garden of Gethsemane. The location is interesting because the garden is located on the northeast edge of Jerusalem, about 100 yards outside the city wall. And Jesus may have been trying to escape from the area and the temple authorities. Mark's gospel has all the earmarks of a government action against civilian dissidents. A number of armed men were sent by the chief priests to arrest Jesus, with Judas among them. The synoptic gospels describe Judas as kissing Jesus in order to identify him. It is not made clear whether the disciples even realized it was Judas who betrayed them. Assuming the story has any historical validity, there have been many fanciful explanations for Judas's motives. Was he an unwilling accomplice? Perhaps he himself had been arrested with Jesus, while his other friends waited in the garden, and he was forced to identify Jesus. He may have been a paid informer, as the gospel suggests, but we cannot rule out the possibility that Judas was an agent working for the Romans right from the start. A small fight broke out, and there have been many guesses about how many weapons were used in the scuffle. Swords and clubs are mentioned in Mark 14:43 through 46. Although it was generally forbidden to bear arms at Passover, Jews were permitted to act in self-defense. Matthew 26:52 says Jesus forbade armed resistance. Admirable advice for a Roman subject, but a trifle late to save Jesus. In Mark and Luke, Simon Peter drew his sword and struck off the ear of the servant of the high priest who had come to supervise Jesus' arrest. Some scholars assert that at least a few of Jesus' disciples were carrying concealed weapons, as did the Sicarii. Now, what he doesn't mention is that Jesus grabbed the ear and put it back on. So I don't know which gospel that's in, but it not only was it, he completely undid the violence that Simon Peter had done. Okay, much ingenious reconstruction has been used in calculating how many men came to arrest Jesus in the garden. Mark is vague and merely says a crowd, oklos in Greek. Others have the image of between 10 and 30 men, including a Jewish functionary or two, some representatives of the high priest, a contingent of the temple guard, perhaps one or more Roman officials of a small unit of Pilate soldiery. In Luke, they are the temple guard, stregigoi tu hieru. And in John, a cohort under the command of a tribune, Sparakaiho Chiliarchos. John's version would entirely change the scope and meaning of the events in Gethsemane. A cohort has a very exact meaning in Roman military terms. It was 1/10 of a legion, as many as 600 soldiers. It seems implausible that Pilate or any other military governor in his situation would have dispatched upwards of 500 or 600 troops to Gethsemane for the sole purpose of arresting one man, a solitary, unarmed prophet who preached love and was attended by 12 disciples. The Bible seems to constantly exaggerate numbers. This is the Old Testament, but talking about Moses and the Exodus, they say that there's 600,000 men, not including women and children. That's like, say 1,500,000. That's like 15 full football fields. Football stadium, giant football stadiums. And, they're just, how are you going to move a group like that? And feed a group like that? You're going to, that's like three Woodstocks at its peak. They completely destroy everything that they go past. And there's no way to communicate. Also, the Romans were not yet involved in the story. 3 Gospels portray Jesus' own surprise at the size of the guard sent to arrest him. He asks them if they suppose that he is one of the Lestai, or the bandits, that they should have arranged a full military arrest. As we have seen, Lestai is a term often taken to mean social bandits or revolutionaries who use brigandage against collaborators and occupying forces as a form of social protest. Later in the narrative, Mark 15:7, it is revealed that Jesus Barabbas had been guilty of a murder in the uprising. There are, I believe, 4 characters in the New Testament named Jesus, so you have to pay attention. Jesus Barabbas had been guilty of a murder in the uprising, as were the other 2 Lestai, crucified alongside of Jesus of Nazareth. Evidently, there was an uprising we know nothing about. The Romans were not slow to arrest the Jews involved, and Jesus was executed between 2 of them. Either this was a case of mistaken identity, and Jesus was rounded up with the usual suspects, or he was involved in the revolt, and the evidence has been suppressed. Since Peter, James, and John were not arrested by the Romans, Jesus' followers were either not yet under suspicion or they escaped